Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I'm Richard, and this is Track of the Week on Lap of the World. Last Friday, we virtually visited and learned what we could about the somewhat enigmatic Autodromo Carlos Romero, the southernmost track in the world. With very little information on that track available electronically, the struggle was real on research. Fortunately for this installment, our destination this week has lots of information available. Indeed, this video almost made itself in a more literal sense than usual. I have to thank Andy from Andy's Videos for reaching out and offering his amazing overflight footage as the backdrop for our exploration of Brooklands, the first permanent paved and banked racetrack in the world. Diving right in, Brooklands opened in June of 1907 and represented the first construction of a permanent paved and banked motor racing circuit in the world. You'll note there I did not say it was the first racetrack in the world, nor even the first purpose-built track. It was indeed predated barely by Aspendale Racecourse in Australia. That track, built for cars inside the perimeter of a horse racing track, used a crushed cement surface and opened in 1903. Elsewhere, a few flat dirt ovals in the US were also operating prior to 1907. However, when it comes to circuits built and paved specifically for cars, the buck stops with Brooklands. There have been longer, there have been steeper, there have been faster, but there were none before. And yes, I hate to break this to my fellow Americans, but that does mean the legends were false. The sweeping high-banked turn was not invented by George Washington, Dale Earnhardt, and Carroll Shelby in 1776 just outside of Talladega, Alabama. No, credit for the first actual bend of tilted tarmac on a closed circuit goes to Hugh and the Colonel, just outside Weybridge, Surrey, England, and that is today where you can still find what's left of the Brooklands motor racing circuit. The idea for building a circuit, and most of the money to do so, was that of one Hugh Locke King, a wealthy British entrepreneur. But credit for the actual design, significant project scope creep, and construction goes to Colonel H.C.L. Holden. Built on what was originally Locke King's estate, with Colonel Holden's encouragement, the concept of the circuit went from a simple road course initially to the high-banked monstrosity that was eventually built. Having broken ground in late 1906, construction only took 9 months to complete, but in that time proved ruinously expensive. Issues with getting tarmacadam, or asphalt, to stick at 30 degrees from vertical meant the entire track had to be surfaced in concrete, all 3.25 miles at 100 feet wide. The stress of the project and hemorrhage of money led Hugh to turn over management of the project to his wife, Ethel, part of the way through, possibly a contingency of Ethel's family bailing out the project financially. And so it was Ethel who actually led the first parade laps of the track at its 1907 inauguration in her own car. The impetus for all this trouble, and what Hugh was potentially banking on for a buyback on his investment, was widespread concern by England's burgeoning automobile industry that they were at risk of falling well behind France. This distress was fallout from the passage of the 1903 Motor Car Act that threw a blanket 20-mile-per-hour speed limit across the entirety of England. How were British carmakers to push boundaries and engage in sustained high-speed testing if they were legally barred from doing so on public roads? The answer, in the Locke King's mind, was Brooklands. Designed with a somewhat bean-shaped layout, the 2.75-mile outer loop, consisting of a long straight, 2 banked turns, and a right-hand kink. In addition to the outer loop, a finishing straight, a convention borrowed from horse racing, brought the total available track surface to 3.25 miles. Of that 3.25 miles, about 1.25 were banked. Significantly. The banking itself is worth discussing. Brooklands used a progressive banking, that is to say it's more of a literal bowl, in that it starts relatively flat towards the bottom and gets increasingly steep as you move toward the outside of the track. It reaches a maximum incline of around 30 degrees, which meant it had a zero steer speed that was approaching the maximum speed of cars at the time. For the first application of concrete banking for cars, they jumped straight in the deep end with this one. For context, the banking at Daytona International leans only 1 degree steeper. Though Daytona's banking is a consistent 31 degrees across its entire width, or certainly once you get much above or outside the apron. Neither of these are the steepest banking ever devised. There are short tracks in the United States with nearly 40 degree banking, and some crazy Spaniards built a circuit with alleged 60-degree slopes. And that's before we even talk about Mercedes' bonkers Steilkurve at their Stuttgart facility. The steepest banking I've driven thus far myself was at Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is a relatively mild 24 degrees, but already has you looking at the top of the windshield to see where you're going. Speaking of driving, it didn't take long for people to begin to put the circuit to use. Just 11 days after Mrs. Lock King's inaugural parade, Brooklands hosted the world's first 24-hour race. This involved 3 cars actually vying for the 24-hour distance record. The eventual victor, one Selwyn Edge, claimed the record at 1,581.74 miles at an average speed of 65.91 miles per hour, handily beating the previous record set in the United States at just over 1,000 miles around a street circuit. Over the years, at least a few other records were broken at Brooklands. George Stanley claimed a 1-hour motorcycle distance record, Percy Lambert was the first person to actually cover 100 miles in 1 hour, and Violet and Evelyn Cordery drove 30,000 miles in less than 30,000 minutes, or nearly 21 days. I don't have the details on exactly how that was accomplished, but my back hurts just thinking about it. Of course, regular racing, more or less as we know it today, also happened at Brooklands. Given this was the early days of motor racing in general, and Brooklands being the first purpose-built track in the UK, it was somewhat up to those organizers to set the precedent for what closed-circuit racing would look like, at least initially. Borrowing from what they knew, you might be entertained to know that the first races saw drivers wearing colorful silks, so as to be more easily identified in the same manner as horse jockeys. Some terminology was also borrowed from the equestrian racing, with cars prepared in a quote-unquote paddock, and if you wondered when tires were first equated to shoes, it was probably here. Racing continued from open day all the way up to 1914, when proceedings paused for something to do with an archduke coming down with a case of dead. Racing then resumed in 1920, with various sanctioning bodies hosting Grands Prix and long-distance races of 200 to 500 miles. Through the 1920s and well into the 1930s were Brooklands' heyday. 2 new circuit layouts were put into use or constructed: the Mountain Circuit, simply a short course using the existing track surface, and later the Campbell Circuit, which added a winding road section that cut through the infield so as to better compete for races with the then new Donington Park and Crystal Palace tracks. Brooklands' social profile also grew, putting it in the same discussions as Wimbledon and Ascot with respect to sporting venues, and it became a hot ticket for the British elite. Of course, with success came some challenges. I have no corroboration of this, but I suspect Brooklands was probably the target of what had to have been the first sound complaints directed at a racetrack, leading to a 24-hour race that was scheduled being split into 2 12-hour races to avoid making noise overnight. Nonetheless, the motorsports boom continued at Brooklands right up until some German ruined the fun in 1939. In peacetime, the racetrack also saw duty as an aerodrome, so as World War II broke out, it was requisitioned by the government and facilities were set up on the ground to build aircraft. This alone didn't spell the end of the track, but with the Vickers and Hawker assembly lines vital to the defense of Great Britain, protecting the facility meant disguising it. To hide the fairly distinct shape of the circuit from the Luftwaffe bombers, structures both false and functional were built on the track and trees were planted on and around it. Almost all of this worked, but a few bombs still found their mark. The net result of the industrializing, camouflaging, and bomb damage meant that the cost to return Brooklands to a usable state after the war became untenable. It would have been physically possible, but it would have taken years to recondition the track, and there were other national priorities at the time, so the owners elected to sell the track to the Vickers Armstrong Company in 1946, and that was the end of racing at Brooklands. 1951 saw a section of the banking removed to accommodate a longer runway for larger bombers. The 60s saw a vast expansion of the aero-industrial complexes within the track, culminating in massive facilities that contributed in part to the construction of the Concorde supersonic jetliners. Though since the 70s the major airplane construction has moved elsewhere, a descendant of Vickers, BAE Systems, still maintains some facilities at the site. More recently, there have been efforts to clean up and preserve, if not recondition, sections of the old racing circuit. These initiatives have been led by the Brooklands Museum, an institution probably most well known for its displays of historic aircraft, which include a Wellington bomber that was recovered from Loch Ness, no monster included, and one of the remaining Concordes. Now, in addition to the planes, if you visit, you can walk on and over the old track surface, see a period replica of a circa 1940 aircraft hangar, And since this overflight, I understand that even more of the old track surface has been cleared of growth and debris, so it's likely that Brooklands, the landmark, if not the racetrack, will still be with us for quite some time. A brief side note, as unfortunate as it is that you can't take a lap of Brooklands in all of its former glory anymore, you can still at least take a lap in Brooklands. In some weirdly ironic twist of globalization, the closest you can get to driving a track that was closed due to a war against Germany is by virtue of a German car company's investment in the British car market. That twisty tarmac in what used to be the infield of the banked circuit is a Mercedes-Benz World driving experience track. Brooklands' fate really is unfortunate. Given its significance to motorsports and pre-war status, I'm sure it was hard to imagine it not being brought back up as a track after things settled down. Thinking in terms of the United States, the equivalent would have been seeing Indianapolis Motor Speedway requisitioned to build Sherman tanks in 1940. The track then built over and sold to Ford Motor Company for pennies on the dollar before having sections of the banking cut away for train tracks and a light office park built in the infield. At least, as I said, Brooklands remains largely intact as a landmark, a monument to itself in the early days of motorsports, and at least we have people who care enough about its history to spend the time and energy to get approval from a litany of authorities and landowners to fly a drone around it so we can all appreciate what must have been. On that note, a massive thanks again to Andy from Andy's Videos. If you want to learn more about Brooklands either as a racetrack, an airplane factory, or museum, check out Andy's channel and website. I've left links to both in the description. I hope I've done the footage he provided justice with this Track of the Week edition. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up below. If I've missed or misstated anything, I welcome input in the comments. And if you don't want to miss any future Tracks of the Week, please consider subscribing. Now, I've said all I can at this point, but I don't want any of Andy's handiwork to go to waste, so please relax and enjoy the rest of his flight, and I will see you all in the next video, if not at the track. Thanks again for watching Track of the Week on Lap of the World. If you enjoyed this video, here are some other Track of the Week videos you might like. Here is what happens when I'm able to visit a track that is still open for business, and here is what YouTube thinks you might enjoy next.